Hi, everybody. Welcome to this conversation we're hosting today about organizing in rural communities around the climate crisis. I want to first just thank all of our panelists here for making the time to have this important conversation today. We're less than 3 weeks away from the election, so the fact that they are all carving out time for this conversation is not taken lightly at all. All of them are running really tight C3, C4 operations in their respective states, and it's crunch time. So today's conversation is focused on organizing for climate justice in rural America. Rural communities are often painted as white, conservative, and as a result, they're not often prioritized by the progressive movement. The expectations for progressive wins are set pretty low, and the support, resource-wise, also stays low. And the climate movement is no exception. One of the false perceptions out there is that folks in rural communities don't care about the climate crisis. And what I'm interested in hearing from our panelists today is, do your experiences working in the field contradict this? And how do you think your folks in the communities you work with perceive the climate crisis? How do you talk about environmental justice with community members at the local level? And what have you seen motivates people to get engaged in organizing on these issues? And we'll start with Johana.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Lydia, and thanks for inviting me back to be part of this wonderful panel with these incredible women. Yes, my name is Johana Bencomo. I am the Executive Director of New Mexico Comunidades en Acción y de Fe, or CAFE. We are the largest faith-based grassroots organizing effort in southern New Mexico, primarily led by immigrants, working families, low-income folks, directly impacted folks to really shift and change the politics of New Mexico so that they benefit our families. I've been doing this work for 6 years, although it feels like a lifetime, but I am a new executive director, just leading this organization this year. I really appreciate this question because in southern New Mexico, I live in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is a city of 100,000, and it's certainly the largest city I've ever lived. And usually my friends who live in larger cities laugh at that, but that's the reality of New Mexico. We are a rural state. And I always talk about rural communities as having untapped potential in community organizing and political spaces. And so, to your point in your question, that is not the reality that is reflected in southern New Mexico. Our rural communities are made up of a lot of people of color, a lot of immigrants, a lot of low-wage working folks, a lot of working folks who are just trying to take care of their families. And I think when in relation to the climate crisis, really it's a double whammy for rural communities, triple whammy in that there's very little resources invested in these communities for organizing and pushing localized progressive policies. But what I mean by a double whammy is that these communities are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change, especially low-income families. But in addition to that, a lot of these rural communities have been devastated by extractive industries like mining, oil and gas, and we include private prisons in that now. And these communities and these families become dependent on these jobs, and these industries don't ever care to stay. They don't care to actually invest in those communities in a meaningful way. In southwestern New Mexico, for example, many of the mines have left, just devastating local economies, leaving counties like Luna County to be one of the poorest counties in the state of New Mexico. And so for us, it's very clear in our political analysis that we must organize and build a powerful base across southern New Mexico and in many of these rural communities if we're actually going to see change.
Hi, thank you again for inviting me back. It's good to see all of you again. And I'm just excited to be on this important conversation. My name is Janie Scott. I'm the Nuclear Harm Reduction and Climate Justice Manager for Georgia WAND. That's Women's Action for New Directions. And I'm located in Waynesboro, Georgia. The WAND office is in Atlanta, but I'm located in Waynesboro. Burke County is the home of the first new nuclear reactor bill in 40 years. So we organize around nuclear and the issues and environmental issues that come along with that. This question is a really good question because a lot of the time, it's really not true, but there are vestiges of it that are. Like in Burke County, we have 23,000 people. We're almost split down the middle, racially divided. So there are a lot of people organizing for progressive issues, but a lot of times because we are very land heavy county and there are a lot of farmers, that is the perception that there's no way in, there's so many gatekeepers, you can't do anything there, so it's wasted to even try. But there are people here that are very invested in climate change and what's going on in the climate. They might not speak it in the same terms, but they know that it's hotter. They know that it floods more here. They're concerned about flooding issues, their flood insurance, do they have it, sheltering in place near a nuclear facility. So they know, you educate them on the proper wording, but people know. So it is very much an untapped potential there. And we do get people that are really excited about climate change and, getting out there and doing the work. So I think it's just being cognizant of people are there. They know that they're being impacted. They want to do something about it. They already are doing something about it. So a lot of it is just bringing resources to the areas that need it.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Veronica Coptis. I'm the executive director with the Center for Coalfield Justice, and we are an environmental and economic justice organization that is building community power in two southwestern counties in Pennsylvania, so Washington and Greene counties. And this part of the state of Pennsylvania is like the hotbed where most of the fossil fuels are being extracted out of the state. So we have some of the largest underground coal mining operations that are still going, even though we often hear the narrative that like coal is dead, like there are still places that it's being extracted. And the fracking that is happening throughout the state. There are many wells in it. And our membership base consists of folks that are directly impacted from this extraction and or are working directly in the industry or have family that are working in the industry. So our community like deeply knows the connection to the economy with these industries, but they also deeply know the way those industries are externalizing the cost onto their communities, public health and infrastructure systems. And so this question around the like false perception of rural communities, I think, we since 2016 have been like a target of national media because we're coal fields who apparently voted for Trump in 2016. And all of these folks are stereotyped to have this ideology. And when you go and you talk like these other communities that were described and you knock on the doors of the folks here, it's not that black and white. People may see some piece of the current president's campaign that speaks to them, but then it's also like often conflicting with values they were raised upon. So I think we're just in a crisis right now in our communities where mass media and people with a lot of power are talking to them in one way, and they were raised in values in a totally different way about care and collectiveness and like supporting one another. And so with investment in getting people back to those values, there's huge potential to shift the way some rural communities in Pennsylvania are voting or showing up on issues around it. And the other thing just to note is that we have a base that crosses the political spectrum, because the people are like, you're getting impacted by fracking whether or not your party affiliation is Republican. It's not like they don't know, they steer away from you because of your party affiliation. And so we have residents who have lost their water, our families who are sick across party lines, and it's actually unifying folks across some other issues on the political spectrum too. And so I just would echo what was said, that if we invest more, and I think the key is that you have to invest in leaders who are there, who are already trying to do the work, really under-resourced. You can't fly in some organizer from somewhere else and try to build in these towns, because trust is like the most critical piece to moving any issue or any campaign in rural communities.
Thank you all. Such excellent points. I want to dig more into a point that was made about these polluters, fossil fuel industry and otherwise, being job creators. That is the reality in a lot of the communities that you all work in. And a part of that dynamic is that they're not just providing jobs, they're also trying to keep a good image. They often, give gifts to the community. They'll do like they fund people to go to college or, things like that, scholarship programs. And so they try to keep a positive image, and it can make really organizing against these companies or holding them accountable for pollution really challenging. So I want to hear if your organizations have dealt with this particular challenge, and if so, how, and how has the community responded to that?
That's a great question, Lydia. In New Mexico, not only are those types of gifts you're describing, not only do those exist, in addition to, and probably more importantly, the New Mexico state budget is either half or a third dependent on oil and gas revenues. So it is, and given what happened this year with COVID, we had about a $2 billion shortfall and continued, probably expected to be similar in the upcoming years. So that really has been raising some pretty big red flags for all of us who are really worried about what that means for safety net programs, for education, right? We have to consider, if we don't have enough money to support the budget, what's going to get cut. And often the fear is that services and programs for those who are most marginalized and affected are going to be first to go. And so really the push for us in this upcoming legislative session is to ensure that those programs are not actually cut, but instead invested in even further. I mean, in New Mexico, like I said, often it's oil and gas that's really the biggest players in the state, but it's also mining, copper mining, and I have to always mention private prisons. And it doesn't necessarily have a tie into climate change, but the industry is still extractive and oppressive, and our communities have definitely depended on it. And it makes even local elected officials want to push back again, or push for policies that invest in a green economy, for fear that they'll lose support, but for fear that they'll lose jobs, even though it is pretty, even though we can't step back and look at the bust and boom effect of some of these industries and actually reflect on whether that's the kind of economy that we want to live in, and that will not, frankly, allow our families and our state to thrive.
Okay, yes, and following up to that, especially in a town like where I'm at, in a county like where I'm at, where it is the largest employer in the county, and multiple people come in from even other states and other counties. So it's very much a job creator, temporary, albeit, and just like you were just saying, there's a rebound effect. So there's all this money and revenue that comes in from the taxes that are created by these big bills that take forever. They go way over budget, and they're way, way out over schedule. So in towns, quote unquote, community towns, where everything is sponsored by these companies, all you have to do is look down at the bottom, and it's sponsored by everything. You have to actually talk to the workers, provide alternatives. We do have a jobs policy. We have hosted job fairs and things like that to try to give people alternatives, to put them into contact with actual employers there, give them help with resume work, where they can find educational resources, because the jobs are there. They're very high paying for a short period of time. And then a lot of people don't realize I bought a house, but this job goes away in 2 years or 3 years or even 5 years. But I can't afford my mortgage now. I can't afford my car. So we try to educate people about that, long-term planning, what happens later. And, what's happening, what kind of pollution is going out, what it's doing to the climate, what's going to be the long-term, effects on your health, effects on the environment, effects on the community at large, because you can just look back to the build that was about 20 years ago and what happened in the community and see what's going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, whenever it comes to an end. So it's just, long-term planning, talking with workers, trying to bring them along where they're at, meet people where they're at, and try to give them as many resources as you can and to help them along and give them alternatives, because a lot of people feel like they don't have an alternative. They have to work for these companies.
Yeah, definitely. I think in our work, this is really critical in how are we like bridging the divide. The narrative that's constantly pushed in Appalachia is like jobs versus environment. We're seeing it now as they want to build out a petrochemical like region in the Ohio River Valley. We're still seeing it in coal. We're seeing it with fracking. And I think, two case studies that we've done to like really try to bridge with workers is I think the first thing is we have to realize that traditional environmental groups have really burned this bridge and have really harmed fossil fuel workers in a bad way, that when even we come in as an environmental organization, and even though we say we're an environmental justice organization, it takes work to trust that their jobs aren't just going to get thrown under the water. And so one way that we did that, about 5 years ago, there was a sale between two mines and two mine operators. And in that sale, one mine operator also sold all the liability and health insurance benefits of retired mine workers. And they were, going to their old union. They were trying all these multiple ways to try to get their healthcare reinstated. And they came to our we actually wrote a letter to the editor that we were criticizing the company about it. And then they found our organization. So I always say, like, letters to the editor can be pretty effective sometimes. And, we had a tense initial meeting. We sat across the table. You believe in this, we believe in that, but we both believe that the company should be responsible for your health care like they promised when you retired. And we know how to organize, and we know how to campaign, and like public pressure, corporate accountability. Campaigns are my favorite type to do. And so we sat them down and we taught them the fundamentals of like power analysis, escalation, campaign building. And then we ended up doing a series of protests outside Kinsale Energy's headquarters, outside of a hockey arena, the Penguins that they were currently purchasing the naming rights to, from the very own men and women who made the company as wealthy as they are, demanding they reinstate their healthcare. And in the end, unfortunately, like with the way capitalism works, they didn't get their healthcare reinstated. The company like cut all healthcare for their workers. But when asked by the CEO to stop working with our organization, their response was they were the only organization that was there to help us. And we made every decision along the way. Like, they were not puppet stringed at all. And then the other scenario where we're working now, as we're trying to move some more just transition policy, is really finding allyship in retired union members. And so and I think the one thing to note too is the fossil fuel industry today is largely unorganized and ununionized. And so I think we actually need to have a bigger conversation on like, where is organized labor's role in trying to provide more protections for fossil fuel workers, particularly the oil and gas sector. And so we're trying to build relationships with unorganized workers, hearing horrible health effects that they're dealing with, and then trying to like talk to organized labor representatives and being like, is there any connection here? Because we're not labor organizers at the Center for Coalfield Justice. And then with retired workers that have a little bit more freedom to speak out about how they're concerned about climate, how transition needs to happen, but because the operators are so restrictive anymore, it's really hard for active workers to say anything without risking their jobs. But we're still having those conversations too. And I think don't underestimate the power of like an angry retired industry worker who has grandkids and is worried about the future of the climate.
Such great stories. Thank you. This is a couple things came up in this last question that I want to tie into my next question. You all touched on essentially the importance of trust and community with folks that have a lot at stake. And that is the reality, that these are issues that really do affect people's day-to-day lives, their livelihood. And my question is this: I know from experience that there are some organizing challenges that are specific to small communities where everyone seems to know each other. And this includes, you know, one of them being that folks with progressive values sometimes are afraid of being perceived as disruptive or too radical because they could be targeted by the extreme right, such as the recently Trump-approved shout out that he did to the so-called Proud Boys, right? We know that these organizations exist, that they are active, and this can naturally make volunteering for organizations like yours sometimes scary or dangerous for folks. And my question is, like, what's most important? What do we need to provide for folks that are volunteering, that want to become activists and advocates in these rural communities, for them to feel safe and supported? What are your organizations doing to address that?
Thanks, Lydia. Yes, I hope you all caught my dog sliding the door open with his nose. That door is no match for them. Yeah, that's a really good question, and that absolutely does happen. I mean, and I don't necessarily think it's fear of being seen as a radical or a disruptor. I sometimes think the members of our base like that, right? There's nothing radical. I think is simply someone who wants to see change, right? But the scary part is that perhaps a lot of folks are undocumented, right? Perhaps a lot of folks have mixed status families in our base, and those are the things that make being very public about their situation some of the scariest things. You know, for us, we really try to lead with relationship and ensure that stories are at the center of our work and people's experiences are at the center of our work, and that anytime we are confronted with a situation like that, we always fall back to that, right? That our stories of pain and struggle can actually be turned into power, and that those stories of pain and struggle are what ultimately going to change hearts and minds, and that's just part of the work. And so, you know, for us, we try to keep that in mind, and you know, and we just had a base meeting not too long ago, and as we prepare for a volunteer civic engagement program, and I sort of teared up in our virtual conference because at the end of our call, I just was thinking about the work that a lot of these folks are doing in our base for this election cycle, many of who can't even vote. And I just, you know, for me, it's important to note that we have their backs regardless of what happens on November 3rd or November 13th, whatever it is, that we have their back, and that will consistently be the philosophy that we lead by, and that we will respect people's decision to be public about their story or not, and whatever role they want to play in the movement, because every single role is valuable and necessary.
That's definitely true. And what we try to do, we try to be very honest with people about what can happen, what might happen to them. We're very security conscious, that's physically, and with our information, you know, we always keep control of our sign-in sheets. There's always someone there when people choose to sign in. If you don't want to sign in with your name, that's fine. We try to be very good keepers of people's information, because a lot of times there is backlash when you organize around certain issues in a small community. So you have to really acknowledge that people can be harmed just for showing up at a meeting. So, and that can be physically or economically. So we really do try to build in, when we're organizing, having enough volunteers, to be conscious of what's going on around the building, in the building, who's coming in and who's coming out, just to be, you know, whenever you organize. And I think that sometimes that people forget about that there is a safety issue sometimes in some arenas of organizing, and you really do have to have a buddy system, watch your real folks, safeguard their information, and be prepared to help them if they do have repercussions from working with you. So just like you said, everybody has a role. It might not be out front. We always ask people about pictures. Do you want to be in a picture? If you don't, you know, here's a certain color that you wear. So we just build all those things into our organizing to make sure people are comfortable. They can share as much as they choose to. We're conscious of when we go live, when we don't go live. So all those type things, just build those into your organizing.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would echo everything that both Johana and Janie said. And I think particularly the having multiple ways for folks to engage is key. So there's like entryways into, becoming more radical. I also don't think like radical is a bad thing. I think the right has painted it as a bad thing. And so, there's behind the scenes work that can happen, and there's work that people can be more public in. And it's really about boundaries. And it's something we're like doing even within our staff team, and then we do with our core leaders, is we don't live in a society where we're like meant to respect our boundaries or respect others' boundaries so often. And so we actually have people talk about like, how far are they willing to go? How far are they not willing to go? And everyone on the team of that action or that event is planning. It's very clear where everyone's boundary is, and we respect those boundaries. And so I think that's a very critical way to move forward. And in this moment, I think the other way we've been thinking about this, because we actually do organize in communities that are 90 to 95% white. I grew up in a high school that was all white. And so we also know that our base is the people that white supremacists are trying to recruit to be more aligned with them, instead of an ideology that is full of care and love and like the abundance of diversity, and how that's an asset and not a risk to their survival. And so we do a lot of conversations around racial justice in our communities, and we push the button, which means we teach our team a lot about de-escalation and to understand if there is armed protesters. Like, how do you know when it's more of a threat or not? How is that person firearms understanding, so that those who are willing to take that risk know when it's a risk that you need to actually like remove your crew of people away from the site, or it's just a posturing of testosterone often instead. And so I think like that's a really key way to keep people safe. And it's that always having your back that you brought up, Johana, that there is going to be a time when a leader of ours or a staff member of ours is going to become the target or the focus of a smear campaign or trying to ruin their credibility. And it means having that person's back. It means making sure that they've got the mental health support that they need through that process, because no matter what, that's hard to be attacked. And it also means making sure they're not the person, especially if it's a staff member, like they're not the person that has to continue to monitor the Facebook page. Like, you remove that responsibility from that individual and give it to someone else instead, so you're not reading any attacks or comments about yourself personally. And in creating space to process those feelings. And then the way we're moving out of it is, I think what all of our organizations are doing, there's power in numbers. And so I think there are more people in rural communities, which gets back to the first question, that feel more aligned to progressive values, but you don't hear it a lot. You don't see leaders talking about it a lot. And so the more people we have speaking up on it, the more people will keep doing it. And then it will just grow in the power of numbers. And it'll be surprising in the end that the hate voice will actually be the quieter voice, hopefully 5 years from now.
Lydia, can I add something to this real quick? Because
absolutely, please do.
In your question, you mentioned this really disgraceful, despicable thing that we saw a couple weeks ago in the debate, when the sitting president told these extremist right-wing groups to stand back and stand by. And just this week, I've started having conversations with our partners around voter protection at the polls, and the kind of voter intimidation that we're seeing that I never thought I would have to organize around, that I know has existed for years, for centuries, right? And I had never seen it personally, and it's really interesting, the kind of turn that we have taken in the last few weeks leading up to the election, particularly for voters who are voting for the first time, who are voting in rural communities, who are now potentially going to be faced with, for example, in New Mexico, we have the infamous Cowboys for Trump and the New Mexico Civil Guard, who've been showing up to protest in the last few months for the Black Lives Matter movement and movement against police brutality. But now we're seeing, and there's this risk of them showing up to the polls, and it just such a, we are used to all these other protections for the members of our base, but now having to talk about what it means to protect people at the polls is really hard and infuriating. And for so many rural communities, there's not enough poll watchers. There's not enough sort of those protections that can really help people feel safer.
Such a great point. Thank you. And it's a very lively topic right now, especially since early voting has started in so many places. Very, very important. And with that, I just want to obviously point out that this is an election, like Johana said, unlike any other in history. I think that's safe to say. But let's end on a hopeful note. And I want to know, what message can you offer to organizers who are worried about the outcome, that are worried about this process? What can we say about what it's going to mean for the future of our fight for climate, economic, and racial justice? All of the things that we work on, just to name a few. What makes you hopeful?
Honestly, I think that a lot of things make me hopeful. I've always said that the minute that I start losing my optimism, or the fact that maybe we just can't win, is probably the day I need to quit. But I really do believe in the power of organized people in changing policies and changing narrative and changing culture. And for me, I'm inspired every single day by the members of our base and I get to organize with faith-based communities, and so a lot of people who really hold on to their faith, and it's what gets them through some of the toughest moments. And to me, it makes me lean harder on my faith as well. And I'm also really inspired by the incredible amount of women of color running for public office at all levels. I think that that's super powerful. I have to say, I myself am a member of my city council here in Las Cruces, and I'm seeing, though, more and more myself reflected in those positions of power, and I think that that's really exciting.
For me, it's all of that, and the youth. The youth have so much energy, and they have so much energy for these issues, especially climate, racial issues. I was having a conversation with a young lady about 15, and she was telling me about some issues she had in school that were racial since the quote unquote, what people say, uprising or whatever, this new energized movement for Black lives. And she was like, I have never experienced any type of racist, comments or whatever, but it's so blatant now. And she was so energized to be a part of the movement just for that reason. And it's like, there's so much energy behind the youth in all of these issues. And it's not like they're showing up and it's a fad. They really, really, really feel it. And they know that this is going to be for their kids. Even though they are kids now, they're looking forward to the future. And I think that's part of it. We have elders that are still around that triumphed over a lot of issues in the past that are still here that we can learn from. So it's just bridging the gap between elders, youth, and people that are somewhere in the middle. I think we have a lot of energy for it. We know we can't fail. We have to keep moving. So I always have hope, because I know that even if I'm gone on, somebody's going to take it up and keep going. So that what gives me hope.
Yeah, I also feel like if I can't see like the light at the end, then I probably shouldn't be a director anymore, as well. But yeah, I mean, I will say it has been really challenging in this moment. We're in Pennsylvania, so like obviously we're apparently a very critical election state. So we're seeing lots of advertising, lots of conversation, lots of organizing. There's lots of messaging happening throughout our communities in conflicting ways. But I think what's giving me hope in this moment is, you know, for the first time, sometimes seeing more of the liberal white base in the movement, really buying into the intersectional lens that has to happen to address our problems, that we're not actually going to solve the climate crisis if we're not also talking about racialized capitalism, and that like the climate crisis isn't the symptom or the cause, it's a symptom of a bigger cause. And so what's really giving me hope in this moment is to see larger, like traditional progressive organizations that have been white led and mostly serve white communities kind of like getting it for the first time, because we are experiencing like what intersection of multiple crises happening right now in our country too. And like, it's unfortunate it took that to do it, but seeing that recognition in Pennsylvania by partners of ours and the work to move forward actually leads me to believe in the coming years we're going to be able to have some pretty big issue-based wins that aren't leaving any sector of our state out of the conversation, and that folks are really seeing the importance of like a people-centric movement moving forward beyond this.
Thank you all so much. Phenomenal conversation by some phenomenal leaders. Thank you for taking the time out to share some of this invaluable wisdom with us, especially in this critical time. You know, this is a point in history. It's an important point in history, but as Janie said, this happens before us and it will continue happening after us. And so thank you for the role that you all play, and it's a very important role that you all play in your states, in your community, in this country. And I look forward to continuing this fight with you all.